This episode is brought to you by Early Innings, an anthology of the first 4 years of the Twin Bill. Featuring over 200 pages of baseball poetry, short stories, essays, interviews, comics, and art, it tells the story of what it means to love baseball today. The Athletic's Tyler Kepner said, like a box of ballpark Cracker Jack, there's a delightful surprise on every page of the Twin Bill's Early Innings. This is a collection to be savored, a loving and lyrical celebration of the art of baseball. Early Innings is available now from 406 Press. This episode is also brought to you by Ben Shahan's Short Relief. It asks the question of what happens when men are not ready to give up that boys' game, the national pastime. In 9 stories, he traces the stories of a minor league pitcher holding on to his last shred of hope for promotion to the show, little leaguers' formative experiences, and a host of men and boys in between. Short Relief is out on 406 Press and available at 406press.com. Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. The Whiz Kids are one of those magical teams known by a nickname, yet so much of their story is what didn't happen. Namely, that this young, talented Phillies team, which featured 2 future Hall of Famers in Richie Ashburn and Robin Roberts, only made it to the 1950 World Series and never returned. Dennis Snelling's new book, The Whiz Kids, How the 1950s Phillies Took the Pennant, Lost the World Series, and changed Philadelphia baseball history forever, tells the story of how the Whiz Kids came to be, their rise, and their fall. I learned a lot. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Dennis. How you doing today?
Really good. Appreciate you having me on, Scott.
Well, my pleasure. The book is fantastic. This is a team that I think baseball fans know the name Whiz Kids. They don't necessarily really know a whole lot about not only the Whiz Kids, but what led to the Whiz Kids and what then happens after the Whiz Kids year. We'll get into that, but first, I always like to start off by asking, where does this idea for you start? Where does this come from?
Well, I always like to find stories that are good stories and allow some room to meander in different areas and explore different things. And my last book was on Lefty O'Doul, but it was 8 years ago. So it took me a while to find something else. Lefty was interesting because you got to delve into Japanese baseball and hitting instruction in general and kind of the nature of fame and what makes someone famous and what doesn't. This one, well, Lefty played for Philadelphia. And like you said, the Whiz Kids, I knew the basic outline of the story. And it just kind of fell into place at a certain point where I realized, hey, there was some room to take a look at what makes a dynasty happen and not happen, and explore some other things like taking Robin Roberts and Curt Simmons, who kind of have a career arc that paralleled each other and had some similar things happen to them. And they ended up being friends, even though they were opposites in so many ways, and kind of exploring that. So it gave some room to do some exploration. And I think ultimately, if you're going to write a book, you have to be curious about the subject and want to know more about it. And that kind of fit the bill here. So
all the players are gone now. Curt Simmons was the last surviving Whiz Kid, died, 3 years ago now, just about?
Yes.
So what went into this research? I assume you weren't really able to talk to a whole lot of the players or anything like that.
Right. For this book, that was less of a need, I thought, for the way that I was approaching it. And you'll kind of tell I have a prejudice towards, if I'm going to have quotes, that I want them as close to the event as possible. So I relied a lot on newspaper things. I've done books where I've interviewed a lot of people. I have kind of an 80-20 rule that 80% of the people are going to remember 80% of the stuff wrong, and 20% will be fairly reliable. And I find the further away from an event, the less accurate it is. Now, there are certain things you have to make kind of judgments even on quotes that are close to the time of the event. Sometimes being too close to an event can be an issue. So you kind of have to use your judgment. But I like to write where things unfold for the reader as if you were sitting there at that time. So this book is kind of written from what a 1950 Phillies fan would look back at Phillies history, and then kind of as things unfold. And having those quotes from that time, I think, worked for that, or that was kind of my aim. And so I was less concerned about that. Plus, the players were gone anyway. I couldn't really do anything about that. But this is more of a historical look, putting the team in a historical place rather. There's been some great books with oral histories. I mean, Paul Rogers, who also did some peer reading for this, he and Robin Roberts did a fantastic book in 1996 with oral history of most of the players who were around at that time. And I used things from that, and Paul shared some of his audio tapes of interviews that he had. Saber had a few interviews where I was able to use some things. So I did get some players' voices in it. But I'm always careful, even with those things. It's sort of, there's certain types of reminiscences that are okay, reflections and certain things. But when you're getting into remembering specific facts, you always check them. Stan Lapata talked about the play at home plate. Well, when I compared the picture, his reminiscence was pretty accurate. So I used his quote about it. You could tell, the way he described it was the way that when you look at the photo of the play, it looks good. So you go, okay, that seems like a memory that is reliable. But you agonize over that a little bit when you're writing, is trying to get everybody's quotes right and making those decisions. Sometimes, you're more sure than others. You'll see that I'll say reportedly, or, there's the quote where Eddie Sawyer talked about when he quit the second time, I'm 49 and I want to be 50 is why he quit. Well, I didn't find a quote from that time about that. So I just said reportedly he said that. It was actually a secondary source from Robert Roberts from his autobiography is where I got it. Doesn't mean that it couldn't be found. I just didn't find it.
I believe it's the first chapter of your book. It has probably the greatest title I've ever seen in a baseball book for a chapter. I believe it's not always concise, but nonetheless relatively brief history of Philadelphia baseball team from its beginnings, with particular emphasis on the trials and tribulations of the Philadelphia Phillies up to and through 1942. That is fantastic. I laughed when I saw that. I thought that was great. But to kind of put this team in perspective, this is a kind of a historically bad franchise up to this point. They have 16 straight losing seasons between 33 and then 48. Can you kind of just briefly, actually concisely, bring us up to where the Phillies are in relation to the rest of baseball and in relation to Philadelphia and yeah.
Yeah, the title, I enjoyed that. It's kind of a mimic of the way 19th century titles would be in books. And so I kind of used that, and I had to fight the publisher a little bit on it. I just kind of insisted, no, I want to keep that. I'm doing it for a reason. The Phillies, I go back to 1883. And of course, the book actually goes back into Philadelphia baseball history all the way back into the 80s. But the Phillies pick up in 1883 when they were brought back to the National League after they were one of the original National League franchises and were dropped along with New York for some malfeasance in not finishing some road trips at the end of the year. They were expelled. But the league, there was a rival league, the American Association, that came up and put teams in Philadelphia and New York, so the National League kind of had to respond. So that was kind of the origin of the Phillies. And they had some really good teams in the late 19th century, some really good players. There's a really fascinating little sidebar on a guy named Charlie Ferguson, who no one probably remembers, but was maybe one of the greatest players in Phillies history. A two-way player, a true two-way player, led the team in hitting and pitching. And they had an outfield in the 1890s that all three guys hit 400 in the same season, but they just never won. They had some incidents where they were trying to signal players with the third base coaches essentially being given electric shocks from a backup catcher sitting in center field in the manager's office, signaling to the players. They had a ballpark that in 1903, the outside of it collapsed and killed 25 people. They went through ownerships. They had two owners over time that were banned from baseball, one of whom was part of the ones that was just reinstated along with Pete Rose. He was for gambling. They had one pennant in 1915 with Grover Cleveland Alexander helped pitch. He had three straight 30-win seasons and helped pitch them into the World Series in 1915, where they won one game and didn't win another World Series game until 1980. So they finished last in earned run average almost every year. They ended up abandoning Baker Bowl and moved in with the Philadelphia A's for a while until their success kind of drove the A's out of Philadelphia. So they finished last, I think, just about every year. I think they had one winning season between 1917 and 1948. And, they had some great performances. Lefty O'Doul hit 398 one year for the Phils. He had 32 home runs and only struck out 19 times that year, and still holds the National League record for hits in a season with 254. So they had Chuck Klein was a great player, MVP. But they would financially have to sell these players off just to keep surviving. And so it was a pretty bleak existence for Phillies fans for, I would say by 1950, there were a lot of fans that had never known the Phillies to be anything other than lousy.
Yeah. Yeah. So what changes then? How does this historically bad team all of a sudden start to win some games? What goes into this?
So William Cox bought the team in 1943. The previous owners, the Nugents, had to sell. Were kind of forced to sell by the National League because financially they just couldn't make it, and they owed $250,000 to the National League itself. So they forced him to sell. William Cox owned the team for a year. There's a chapter about how tumultuous that was. And then he got banned from baseball for betting on the team, basically after he fired the manager, and the manager ratted him out. And so then the Carpenters, Bob Carpenter Sr., who was married into the DuPont family, bought the team and turned it over to his son, Robert Jr., 1944. He hired Herb Pennock, who was a family friend and was working for the Boston Red Sox, running their farm system. They brought him in to be general manager, probably the first general manager the Phillies had ever had in their entire existence. And the idea was, let's build a farm system. They'd seen what had happened with the Cardinals and a couple other teams that had become contenders that way, and felt that was the way to go. And of course, the war interrupted that process for a while, but they ended up building that team piece by piece over the rest of the 90s that culminated in the pennant in 1950.
So to me, and maybe this is, the book is sort of built around the careers and the journeys of Robin Roberts and Curt Simmons. You focus a lot on them, their entire stories. And it really kind of seems like this turning point when they decided, hey, we're going to invest in these bonus babies at the time. Who were Robin Roberts and Curt Simmons? What were the two of them like?
So Curt Simmons was actually drafted out of high school. There were a lot of teams after him. He was a left-hander that actually signed with the Phillies after the Phillies took the whole team to this little town, Egypt, Pennsylvania, where Simmons played a game against the local town team to basically give him a tryout. But there were 7 or 8 teams after him, and he signed for $65,000 bonus, which was a tremendous, I think it was a record amount at that time. And under the rules of the time, he had to come up to the major leagues by the end of the season. And at the time, he's 18 years old and beats the New York Giants on the last day of the season, pitching a complete game against a team that had already set the major league record for home runs in the season that year. He was what he called himself an unlucky, lucky guy, and was kind of seen as a pessimist. He was a left-hander, really wild, wind-up, kind of cross-firing, and as a result had some arm problems during his career. Robin Roberts was actually a big basketball star at Michigan State, and then wanted to play baseball and became a pitcher because he couldn't hit well enough. College coach wouldn't give him a chance to play that way. But he ended up getting in with a guy named Ray Fisher, who actually was a coach at Michigan, where Robin was at Michigan State, and ended up playing in a summer league, and that really developed him. So Roberts was more of a smooth type pitcher. He's a right-hander, a college graduate, very dour on the mound. Al Barlick, an umpire, said he had the disposition of an oyster while he was pitching, and a wind-up and follow-through that is almost identical to Tom Seaver, for those that know him, very much like that. Very durable, never really had arm problems during his career. He pitched 300 innings year after year. At one point, he still holds the record, I think, with 20 straight complete games, which is the record since 1920, since the end of the dead ball era. There's no players currently who even have 28 career complete games, I don't believe. I think Kershaw has 15. I think that's the most. So, and he had 6 straight 20-win seasons. And he was more of an optimist. And then it was just kind of interesting to have a chapter basically on their signing and their minor league season when they start, kind of following them through. And then there's a chapter of how their career went after the Phillies, when they were both released by the Phillies. And they both had good success afterwards. But it was kind of interesting that Simmons, the pessimist, had an easier time letting go of playing than Roberts did, the optimist. So just kind of contrasting those two. Yet they were good friends. They were business partners. They stayed close, and their careers ended within a few months of each other and started within a few months of each other.
So the 49 season, it's a bit of a surprise, I think, for everyone. This young group of guys. I want to talk about this really quick because I think a lot of people know The Natural. What happens to Eddie Waitkus in the middle of the season?
So Eddie Waitkus was acquired by the Phillies from the Cubs prior to the 1949 season. A fantastic defensive first baseman, pretty good hitter, no power, but he generally hit right around 300, and an all-star a couple of times. And he was one of the pieces that was not a draft choice. He was actually acquired in a trade. And he was actually the oldest of the starting players. He had just turned 30. Unknown to him or anyone else other than the people close to this woman, this 19-year-old had become infatuated with him while he was with the Cubs and basically stalked him and planned to kill him. Basically, if I can't have him, no one can. And she never met him, had just seen him at the ballpark. She would spread pictures of him all around her apartment. She'd hold conversations with him in her head as he walked down the street. And when he went to the Phillies, she didn't change her attitude about him. And she basically planned to be in the same hotel when he would arrive. She went and bought a rifle, got it into the hotel, and sent a note basically saying, hey, I have something to talk to you of importance. And Waitkus made the unfortunate decision to go. She had a friend there. It's kind of interesting, the whole aspect of how mental health is treated now versus back then. She was clearly insane. Her friend went with her when she bought the rifle, and her remark to the police was that the rifle cost $21, I think, and $21, and the bullets were extra, I think. That cavalier attitude of, well, nothing will happen, And so he comes into the room, goes, so what's this issue of importance? She had originally planned to stab him and then shoot herself, but he moved so fast she didn't have a chance to do that. So she goes, I have a surprise for you. Goes to the closet, pulls out the rifle. He goes, what's this about? And she shoots him in the chest, and then was so flustered she couldn't bring herself to kill herself. He was still alive, so she calls down, basically saves his life in an ironic way, because he would have bled out. She ended up being sent away to Kankakee State Hospital and spent a couple of years there. And he managed to miss the rest of the season and had a really tough comeback, both mentally and physically. He never really recovered mentally. But physically, he came back and had a really great season in 1950. But he was really never the same, and that's kind of understandable.
There's some pretty interesting players on this team. Obviously, the Waitkus thing is kind of hanging over the whole season. Is there anyone that you, in researching this, you really came to respect or thought was underrated, or a player that you really came to enjoy through this process?
Well, there are a lot of players. I mean, like you said, a lot of interesting personalities. Jim Constanti, who won the MVP award, his personal pitching coach was an undertaker who lived next door to him. And actually, Robin Roberts asked him for help. He was kind of an amateur. He was actually a bowler, and he would talk about, well, why can't you use some of the spins used on bowling on baseball? You had Russ Meyer, who had a tremendous temper and would always have to apologize for it. There's a picture of him in the book apologizing to a photographer, with Meyer wearing the craziest pajamas I think I've ever seen in a posed photo because he tried to punch the photographers taking a picture of him at a game. You've got, Del Ennis, Dick Sisler, Del Ennis to me was probably the most underrated, if you were to ask me. And if you look at his numbers and his impact on the team, but he was a quiet guy, just went about and did his business. But he had like 4 100 RBI seasons in a row, 5 or 6 overall with the Phillies. And yet he was kind of a target of boo birds a lot of his career for some reason. One of those things, Jackie Jensen kind of went through that in Boston, where just they'd be really good, but I guess for some reason they weren't as great as people thought they were going to be, and always disappointed. Dick Sisler, I talk about, had the great home run on the final day that kind of saved the Phillies, and his dad was, of course, the legendary George Sisler, and spending his life in the shadow of that as a ball player was tough. So, yeah, a lot of fascinating personalities and some really interesting stories, I think.
So coming into 1950, what are the expectations for this team?
They were generally picked to finish second or third. There were some that still thought they might finish in the second division. In 49, they had finished third, and that was the first time they finished in the first division, like I said, in 35 years. And it was kind of interesting because the Philadelphia Athletics also were kind of on the uptake. They'd had really good seasons in 48 and 49. And Connie Mack was going into his 50th season as manager of the Athletics, and there was a lot about that golden anniversary there that is talked about some in the book in that contrast. While the Phillies won, the A's collapsed, and that ended Mac's career and was the beginning of the end for the A's in Philadelphia. The Phillies, probably the 1950 season, may have saved them being in Philadelphia. And the A's leaving, because the A's were the dominant franchise much of the time. But the timing of when the Phillies did it, in concert with the fact that major sports were going through a bit of a financial crisis in the early 50s post-war and made finances tight, that kind of forced franchises to move and killed most of the two major league team cities. That's what I was looking for, like Boston, St. Louis, and Philadelphia. And so it probably saved them. If they had continued on as they had, they may have been the ones that moved. But they were generally picked to finish third or fourth.
You kind of, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. You kind of hinted at this a little bit. They have a great August, and then they almost blow it. They have a really rough September. I think they have something like a 7-game lead with 11 games left or something like that at the very end of the year. And they almost blow it. What happens down the stretch here?
Yeah, the parallels to 64 when they did collapse is uncanny. They lost 3 pitchers in September. Curt Simmons his National Guard unit was activated, and so he went into active service. So they lost him, and at the time he was actually leading the major league in wins. He had 17 wins when he was pulled out. I think Roberts had 16 at that point. And then they had injuries back. Bob Miller earlier in the year had hurt his back, and it had hampered him. He tripped on some steps going down to the railway station in Philadelphia. They had sent him ahead to go to a game in Boston. And so Miller was kind of favoring that and ended up messing up his shoulder during a game and tightened up, and he couldn't pitch. And then Bubba Church, one of their other starting pitchers, Miller and Church were both rookies and really came on strong, especially in the second half. Church had a ball lined back at him by Ted Kluszewski under his eye. He was lucky he didn't lose his eye. Actually, for a few moments, he thought he had. And while both Miller and Church pitched a few innings before the end of the year, they really weren't effective. And so you were down to Robin Roberts, and Jim Constanti, the relief pitcher, had a tremendous season. He was named National League Most Valuable Player, appeared in a record 74 games in the regular season, won 16 of them, had several outings where he pitched 8 or 9 innings in relief. And so they just ran out of pitching. But it really was their hitting that went in a slump. Dick Sisler was out for part of September with a sprained wrist, and you'll see in the book there's a picture of him striking out in the second game of the World Series, and you can see the tape on his wrist. So he was in and out of the lineup, and the team just kind of slumped. Their pitching, even though they lost those pitchers, they weren't giving up that much more runs per game, but their batting, they were like down a 1.5 runs per game. I think they only averaged 3 runs per game in September. So it was just a team-wide funk that they got into, and then they had to end the season with 11 games on the road while the Dodgers had 9 at home, which didn't help. So it was quite a struggle in September, and it came down to that last day.
You do mention there is the Dick Sisler heroics. We've mentioned that a little bit here, and they do get into the World Series. They're playing those 1950s Yankees, which are kind of a juggernaut. This is a very close World Series. They get swept. They don't get blown out of the World Series here. What goes wrong for them in the World Series? Did they have any ideas about this went wrong, or if this was different, things could have maybe ended up differently for them?
They just didn't hit because they had used Robin Roberts so much down the stretch, including the last day of the season. They went with Jim Constanti, actually, his first start of the year. I think his first start since 1948, first start in the majors since 46, I think, and trying something different. And at that point, Eddie Sawyer, the manager, really was down to 2 pitchers he had confidence in, and that was Roberts and Constanti. Russ Meyer was still around, but he'd had battled elbow chips all year long. And so Constanti lost 1-0. He went 8 innings, gave up just 1 run. Roberts goes in game 2, it's 2-1, and goes 10 innings and loses. It was just a hit here or there could have made a big difference, and they just didn't hit. And Sisler combined didn't hit well. The only one who hit decently was Granny Hamner, the shortstop. And I think what was unfortunate is September had to feel like it was a year long. The World Series, there were no off days. So it was basically 72 hours from the first pitch to the last, maybe 75 hours. It was just over before they could even settle in. And that was unfortunate. And what was interesting is the last 4 games in 1915 were all losses by 1 run for the Phillies against the Red Sox. And all of the 1950 games until the 4th game were 1 run games. And so they lost 7 1-run games in a row in the World Series. And even the last game where they lost 5-2, it went down to the last batter. The tying run was at the plate, and they almost rallied, thanks to some Yankees errors and things like that. So it was a good World Series, but not for the Phillies or their fans.
Yeah. Again, so, young team, very, very young team. They make the World Series. They hold their own against the Yankees. You think, hey, this team's going to be back a bunch. And you write pretty extensively about this in the book. What happens next? They don't make it back. What happens here?
It's a combination of things, I think. There were players who had career years. There was some the inevitable injuries. And, that was kind of almost a cottage industry in the 50s. If you look at, different publications, sports magazine or in newspapers, every once in a while there'd be, how come the Phillies aren't repeating? They would ask the players during the 50s. It was sort of like, what happened? And some of them would say, well, we won too early. Or some of them would say the players weren't serious enough about it. They got spoiled. One of the factors I think that I write about is that they were late to the game in integrating. I mean, they didn't have their first player in the major league, the black player in the major leagues, till 1957. They were the last National League team to integrate. And not expanding that talent pool to pull from really hurt them. They tried to do what they had done in the 40s that worked when they signed bonus babies. They just kept doing the same thing. And it was unconventional what they did at the beginning, and it worked. And then it didn't work, but they didn't change. And by the time they got around to looking at that, the Negro Leagues had been completely picked clean by the Dodgers and the Giants. The Yankees were kind of the only exception that weren't doing that were contending. But then, I think it was Richie Ashburn who said, hey, all the other National League teams are getting better and we weren't. They were kind of standing pat with the players they had. And then the farm system, which produced so well in the 40s, didn't produce, especially in the first half of the 1950s. And then ironically, in 57, they got several players who produced from the minor leagues, and it was the Whiz Kids that were still there that had bad years and injuries. 57 might have been a year they could have contended. They were actually in first place for a few days in July, but they fell back. But I think a lot of it was just trying to do the same thing they had done and not adapting to the shift in the baseball world that started on April 15th, 1947. And they were late adapting to that for whatever reason. There's some that say there were racial reasons. Some, I think, if you've had success, it's tough to change that. I think it's a combination of things.
So we're a literary baseball journal, so I have to ask this last question here. There's a connection between the Whiz Kids and Ernest Hemingway. What is that connection?
So that final day of the 1950 season is one that really stuck with Phillies fans and probably still does to those that were around. That last 2 innings, especially, where Richie Ashburn throws Cal Abrams out at the plate. And Ashburn had a reputation for a throwing arm, and Bert Schotten, who was the Dodgers manager, said, Richie Ashburn never threw anybody out before. How could he do that? I actually looked it up, and that was the 5th player Ashburn had thrown out at home plate, including he'd thrown out Eddie Stanky a week earlier again at the Polo Grounds against the Giants. So he should have had a little better scouting report. You had Robin Roberts pitching for 3rd time in 6 days or something like that, going into the 10th inning. And Sisler, who in that 10th inning hits this 3-run home run that finally bails the Phillies out after they had taken a 1-0 lead in the game, and Pee Wee Reese hits a home run that actually goes on a ledge, spins, and stays there. And that's how he hit the home run. It was in play, but no one could get to the ball. And you got to start thinking it's just not going to happen after seeing the lead disappear, and then you lose your 1-0 lead on a fluke play like that. And then Dick Sisler, all of a sudden the sun breaks through the clouds and he hits this 3-run home run in the top of the 10th inning. And Ernest Hemingway was inspired by that to pick up his Old Man in the Sea that he had left incomplete. And Sisler had a great summer in Cuba, playing as he was trying to get round back into shape coming back from World War II, including the longest home run that had been hit in Havana, I think, to that time, maybe, and since, and just had a monster season. And so Hemingway used that in a conversation with the boy, the old fisherman and the boy, talking about baseball and the pennant race in 50. And when I'm talking about, the legendary Joe DiMaggio, and then talking about in the National League, the pennant race between the Dodgers and the Phillies. And I think probably the Dodgers are going to win, but I still remember Dick Sisler and that great year he had in Cuba. And so, yes, Dick Sisler and the 1950 Phillies Whiz Kids made it into a Hemingway novel.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I was so thrilled to see the Hemingway connection in the book there. I only remember the great DiMaggio. I remember like those lines. I don't remember anything about the Phillies. And I went back and was like, oh my gosh, this is in here too. I can't believe, it was great.
A lot of people forget that.
Yeah.
It's just really interesting that it made it in there. And it's just fascinating to me for a guy who lived in his dad's shadow. He did get that one great moment.
That was Dennis Snelling. His book, The Whiz Kids, How the 1950s Phillies Took the Pennant, Lost the World Series, and Changed Philadelphia baseball history forever, is out now. We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twinbill Literary Journal. Until next time,